will tell you that evil announces itself, that it arrives with red eyes and cracked skin and the smell of something rotting, that it limps through the village at night, making sounds no human throat should make, and that you will know it instinctively, immediately in the marrow for exactly what it is. They are wrong. The most dangerous evil in the world arrives wearing the finest cloth. It arrives smelling of shea butter and wood smoke and something almost sweet. It arrives with warm hands and a wide smile and a pot of groundnut soup always on the fire. It arrives early, it stays long, and by the time you understand what it is, truly understand in your gut and not just your head, it has already eaten something you cannot get back. This is not a story about a monster. This is a story about a beautiful woman, about a village that loved her, about children who trusted her, and about the 11-year-old girl who sat in a neem tree for 17 nights and refused, absolutely, stubbornly, at great cost to herself, to look away. Her name was Amma. Remember it. Because before we get to the fire, and there will be fire, the kind that burns blue before it burns out, we must first understand how a village of good, watchful, God-fearing people looked at the same woman for 30 years and saw only what she wanted them to see. We must understand how beauty became a lock and how no one thought to pick it, until a child did. Sit down, pull your wrapper close, the night is long, and this story is older than the village it happened in, older, some say, than the hills that watch over it. It begins, as all the worst stories do, with a woman everyone loved.
In the village of Aboabo, nestled between 3 hills and a river the color of wet earth, there lived a woman so beautiful that men forgot their wives when she passed, and women forgot their own names. She was called Yolanda, Mama Yolanda, and nobody in the village could say with certainty how old she was. The elders, who remembered everything, the great drought of their fathers' fathers, the year the river ran backwards, the war that swallowed half the young men of the district and returned none of them, remembered nothing about her youth. They could not tell you when she had arrived. They could not point to the year she had built her compound or the season she had first appeared on the village path. She had always simply been there, the way the iroko trees had always been there, the way the hills had always been there, as if the village had grown up around her rather than she having arrived into it. Always tall, always smooth-skinned, always with that slow, knowing smile that showed all 32 teeth, the way a cat shows its claws without unsheathing them, a display that was at once an invitation and a warning, though nobody in Aboabo ever read the second part. Her hair was black as the space between stars, thick and lustrous, coiled around her head like a sleeping serpent. Her eyes were the deep amber brown of palm oil held up to morning sunlight, and they caught light in a way that made you feel uncomfortably, as if she were reading something written on the inside of your skull, turning the pages slowly, finding the passages she wanted, folding the corners down for later. She wore kente cloth in deep burgundies and golds, always freshly laundered, always fragrant with shea butter and something else beneath it, something sweet and mineral that you could never quite name, like copper left a long time in the sun. She carried herself the way only 2 kinds of people carry themselves, those who have always been loved and those who have always been feared. In Mama Yolanda's case, Nobody in Aboabo could have told you which one it was. They experienced it as the same thing, which is perhaps the most dangerous confusion a village can make. Her compound sat at the very edge of the village, where the last row of houses gave way to the iroko trees that began their slow, centuries-long project of reclaiming everything. The trees loomed behind her walls, enormous and dark canopied, their roots so old and deep they had grown into the bones of the earth itself. At night, the wind through the iroko leaves made a sound that the children of Aboabo were told was the breathing of the ancestors. Nobody corrected this. It was close enough to true. Inside her compound, there was always a fire, always a great clay pot on the fire, and always in that pot a groundnut soup so fragrant it reached you before you reached her gate. Rich and deep and warm, the smell of a home that has never been cold, of a kitchen that has never known scarcity. She grew sugarcane along the inside of her compound walls, fat green stalks that she cut freely for any child who asked, pressing the pieces into small palms with both hands, and a smile that made the children feel like the most important people in the world. She knew every child in Aboabo by name. She knew their ages, their favorite foods, their fears, the names of their friends. She knew which children had nightmares and which ones had lost teeth, and which ones were learning to braid hair or carve wood or catch fish in the shallow river bend. She asked about them. She remembered everything they told her and asked about it the next time they came, and the time after that, so that every child who visited Mama Yolanda's compound left feeling known and seen and treasured in the precise way that children most want to feel and most rarely do. And the children came. They always came, the way fish come to a lantern held over dark water, drawn entirely by the light, their whole small bodies oriented toward the warmth, never once sensing the hook that waited patiently beneath the surface. Their mothers smiled when they ran toward her compound. Their fathers nodded respectfully when she passed on the village path. The women brought her gifts of yam and palm oil at harvest time, and she received them with gracious warmth and sent the children home with their cloth bags full of sweet things. The men consulted her on disputes, for she had a way of listening to both sides of an argument and finding the resolution that satisfied everyone, speaking in that low, unhurried voice that made you feel somehow that the answer had been obvious all along and that you were simply not clever enough to have found it yourself. She was, in every observable way, the heart of Aboabo, the fixed point around which the village turned, the woman you went to when something was broken, a marriage, a boundary dispute, a child's favor that would not break, and she received all of it with those amber eyes steady and warm, and she helped, and the thing was fixed, and you went home grateful. Nobody asked why she never grew old. Nobody asked why in a village where everyone aged visibly with each dry season, faces deepening, hair graying, backs bending slowly toward the earth, Mama Yolanda remained exactly as she had always been, smooth, luminous, ageless. In Aboabo, as in most places, beauty answered questions before they were asked, and some questions, once answered by beauty, are never asked again.
The first child to vanish was Kelechi. He was 7 years old. He was a gab-toothed, round-faced boy who wore a faded yellow shirt every day of his young life because it was his favorite, and he saw no reason to wear anything else. He was the kind of child who laughed with his whole body, who asked questions about everything and waited with genuine, patient interest for the answers, who could name every bird that came to the neem tree outside his family's compound and had given most of them personal names. His mother, Ngozi, called him her morning, not her sunshine, not her joy, but her morning, because he was the thing that made each day begin. He went to Mama Yolanda's compound on a Thursday afternoon in the deep dry season, sent by his mother to return a clay pot that had been borrowed 3 weeks prior. He skipped down the path with the pot under his arm, stopping twice to examine insects in the dust, and turned once to wave at his mother standing in the compound doorway. She waved back. He went around the bend in the path and out of sight. He did not come home. By the time the sun had finished setting and the first stars were appearing above the hills, Abena was in the path calling his name. Her voice carried across the village the way a mother's voice always carries, with a frequency that bypasses the ears and lands directly in the chest of everyone who hears it. Doors opened, women came out, men put down their tools, and the search began. They searched through the night and into the next day. The men of the village formed lines and beat through the forest with machetes, the blades flashing in the late afternoon light, cutting through undergrowth and calling into the trees. Women walked every path in and out of the village. Children were questioned. Every compound was looked into. The river was checked. The banks, the shallows, the deep bend where the current ran fast after rain. They found nothing. Not a sandal, not a strip of cloth,
Not a footprint in the soft mud beyond Mama Yolanda's compound gate. Not a single thing that could be held in a hand and used to understand what had happened to a 7-year-old boy with a clay pot and a yellow shirt on a Thursday afternoon. Mama Yolanda wept with the family on the second evening, sitting with Abena in the yard while the women of the village brought food that nobody ate. She wept magnificently, great rolling tears down those perfect cheeks, her hands holding Abena's hands, her voice breaking with grief in all the right places. She told them the boy had left her compound well before noon, that she had given him a piece of sugarcane, that she had stood at her gate and watched him walk back down the path herself, had seen his yellow shirt disappear around the bend, had thought nothing of it because why would she? He was a healthy boy on a familiar path in broad daylight. She said all of this with her amber eyes streaming and her voice frayed with sorrow, and she said it so completely, so convincingly, with such evident and overwhelming grief, that not a single person in that yard allowed themselves to form the thought that was forming somewhere beneath the surface of their minds. They buried the thought. They buried it under her tears, under her beauty, under 30 years of groundnut soup and candy tamarind, and children sent home with full cloth bags and smiles. They believed her, because they needed to. 6 months later, a girl named Akoshal disappeared. She was 5 years old, and she had gone to bring Mama Yolanda a gift of ripe plantains her mother had sent. She was gone by the time evening came, and the birds settled in the neem trees, and the first cooking fires were lit across the village. Then 8 months after that, the twins. Kweku and Kwame were 9 years old, the sons of the blacksmith, boys so identical that even their fathers sometimes mixed up their names and laughed about it. They disappeared on a single night. There one evening, gone before dawn, their shared sleeping mat cold and undisturbed when their mother went to wake them for morning chores. She stood in the doorway of their room for a long time before she understood what she was seeing, or rather before she understood what she was not seeing. Then she opened her mouth and the sound that came out split the morning open like an axe through greenwood, and the whole village was awake and running before the echo had finished. The village grieved. The village prayed with an intensity that stripped voices raw and left calluses on knees. Sacrifices were made at the shrine of the river god, a white cockerel, palm wine, the first yams of the new season. Fetish priests from 3 districts were consulted and paid and consulted again. The priests spoke of forest spirits angered by an old transgression, of boundary violations, of ancestral debts unpaid. They prescribed rituals and the rituals were performed. They prescribed sacrifices and the sacrifices were made. The children did not return. The blame settled in many places, on the forest, on the spirits, on careless parents, on the changing of the times, on the deterioration of the old ways, on the failure of the new ones. It settled everywhere and nowhere, spreading thin like water on dry ground, absorbed before it could pool anywhere into the shape of truth. It did not settle on the woman with the amber eyes, because with every disappearance, with every child that did not come home, with every family torn open by a grief that had no explanation, Mama Yolanda grew more radiant, more youthful, more impossibly, devastatingly beautiful. The faint lines that had barely traced the corners of her mouth, gone after Kofi. The slight softening beneath her jaw, gone after Akoshwa. After the twins vanished, she looked standing in the torchlight at the community prayers, like a woman of 25. Not a woman in her prime, a woman at the very beginning of her prime, dewy and luminous and untouched by time. The oldest men in the village looked at her and then looked away, and spoke to each other in low voices in the corners of their compounds at night. They swear she had been there when their fathers were young men. Their fathers had sworn she had been there when their own fathers were young men. The arithmetic of this, if you sat down and did it, led somewhere that none of them wanted to go.
It was a girl named Amma who refused to bury the thought. She was 11 years old, small for her age, with quick, dark eyes that missed very little, and a stubbornness that her mother described as exhausting, and her father privately described, when her mother was not listening, as the quality most likely to save her life one day. She was the kind of child who, when told something did not make sense, could not simply accept that some things do not make sense and move on. She sat with the thing that did not make sense and turned it over and over in her hands, like a stone she was certain had something written on the underside, until she had looked at every surface and knew whether it did or not. She had lost her brother Kofi, the gap-toothed boy in the yellow shirt who could name every bird in the neem tree and had given them all personal names. She did not believe in forest spirits. She had said so to her mother once, a month after Kofi disappeared, and her mother had wept and told her that some things were beyond understanding and that she needed to accept the will of God and the ways of the forest, and Amma had said nothing more about it to her mother. She had simply, quietly, begun to watch. She identified the neem tree 3 days after she started. It grew close enough to the back wall of Mama Yolanda's compound that its upper branches extended over the wall, and from the third major fork, a broad, flat platform of branch created by 2 limbs growing in opposition, you could look down into the compound yard through a gap in the thatch covering. The gap was not large, but it was enough. It was more than enough for a girl who was patient enough to sit still for hours at a time and whose eyes had always been sharper than they had any right to be. She climbed up for the first time on a moonlit night,
wearing her darkest cloth, and settled into the fork of the tree the way you settle into a chair you intend to stay in for a long time. She brought dried fish wrapped in leaves and a small gourd of water. She breathed slowly and did not move, and she watched. For the first 16 nights, she saw nothing beyond the ordinary rhythms of a woman living alone, cooking, sitting by the fire, moving between her main house and the storage hut that was always, without exception, padlocked. Mama Yolanda retired early. Her lamp went out by the time the first roosters of the village were thinking about crowing. The compound was still. The sugarcane rustled. The iroko trees breathed. On the 17th night, Amma brought extra dried fish because something in her chest told her to, a premonition she could not name, a tightening of the air that she felt rather than perceived. She was right to bring it. Past midnight, when the village had been drowned in sleep for hours, and even the dogs had stopped their periodic barking, a lamp was lit inside the main house. Not the orange warmth of a cooking fire, but the sharp yellow flame of a clay lamp, and it moved through the house, visible through the thatched walls in stuttering glimpses. And then the door opened and Mama Yolanda stepped into the yard. She was dressed in white, only white, from shoulder to ankle, the cloth so clean it seemed to produce its own light in the darkness of the compound. Her feet were bare, her hair was down, loose, falling past her shoulders, moving slightly in a wind that Amma, high in the neem tree, could not feel. She walked to the center of the yard and stood still for a long moment, her face tilted slightly upward, her lips moving. The words she was speaking were not in any language Amma had ever heard. They were low and rhythmic, a sound more felt than heard, vibrating at a frequency that Amma experienced not in her ears, but in her teeth, in the back of her throat, in the small bones of her wrists. It was the sound of something very old being called on, not a god Amma had any name for, not any ancestor she had ever been taught to recognize, but something older than any of those, something that preceded names entirely. Amma gripped the branch beneath her and did not move. Then Mama Yolanda turned and walked to the padlocked hut at the back of the compound. She produced a key from somewhere in her white cloth, Amma could not see where, and she opened the padlock and lifted it free and pushed the door open. The door swung inward, and from the darkness inside, Amma heard the sound. She would spend the rest of her life trying not to hear it, and she would fail. It would come to her in the hour before sleep, in the sudden silences between sounds, in the way some rooms go quiet in a particular way that is not the ordinary quiet of empty rooms. It was the sound of a child. Not crying. She had heard crying. She had cried herself every night after Kofi disappeared. She knew what crying sounded like, and this was not it. Not screaming, not calling for help. All of those sounds have hope in them, a belief that someone might be listening, that rescue remains possible, that the world still contains people who are coming. This sound had none of that. It was a soft, hollow whimper, the sound of a small living thing that has been so long in the dark that it has forgotten there is anything outside the dark, that has given up not in a moment of despair, but in the long, gradual way that a flame gives up when it has simply run out of everything that was feeding it. It was the sound of a child breathing through its fear because breathing was the only thing left. Amma pressed her face into the bark of the neem tree branch so hard that the pattern of the bark pressed into her cheek, and she watched, and she did not look away, because not looking away was the only thing she had left to give her brother. Mommy Yolanda reached into the hut and drew out a small figure, a child, perhaps 4 or 5 years old, small even for that age, wearing cloth that had once been colored but was now indeterminate with grime and time. The child made no sound of resistance. It moved the way things move when they have been moved so many times against their will that the resistance has been worn entirely smooth, the way a stone in a riverbed moves with the current because it has long since lost all its edges. Its eyes were half open, but utterly without focus, glazed with something that sat between sleep and waking, and was neither, a state that Amma would not find words for until years later, when a healer explained it to her. What happened in the compound yard after that, Amma would describe only once in the whole of her life, to the Council of Elders, in the compound of Elder Asante, with the lamplight steady on her face and her voice completely flat, emptied of everything except the bare fact of what she had seen. She would not dramatize it. She would not elaborate. She had understood instinctively that the horror of what she had witnessed lived in its plainness, in its matter-of-factness, in the terrible domestic calm with which it had been conducted, and to add drama to it would somehow lessen it, would make it possible for people to file it in the part of the mind reserved for things that are not quite real. She said only this. She was eating, and as she ate, the gray came out of her hair. I watched it leave. She said it without inflection, without pause, without her eyes leaving the elder's face, and the elder, who had heard confessions and testimony and the accounts of dying men for 68 years, looked at this 11-year-old girl's face in the lamplight and understood that she had seen something that had taken something from her permanently, the way very cold water takes the feeling from a hand. And the flat steadiness of her voice was not composure, but its opposite. A person who has gone beyond composure into the country on the other side, where you were simply reporting facts because facts are the only currency that still makes sense. He believed her before she finished speaking. Amma climbed down from the neem tree and ran. She ran the way she had not ran since she was a small child, without strategy, without direction, without thought for anything except the distance between herself and the thing she had just seen. She ran barefoot over the red dirt path, over the stones that bit at the soles of her feet, over the roots of the neem tree that reached across the path like fingers, through the dark village, past the sleeping compounds, past the dying cooking fires with their orange coals, past the shrine post at the edge of the square, until she reached the compound of Elder Asante on the far side of the village, and beat on his wooden door with both fists until the sound woke every dog within 50 meters, and lights appeared in the windows of the surrounding compounds. She beat on the door until her knuckles were raw and bleeding. She did not stop until it opened.
Elder Asante did not want to believe her. He was a man who had spent 68 years carefully constructing and maintaining his disbelief in uncomfortable things. And the architecture of that disbelief was solid and well-maintained, with no obvious doors or windows through which an 11-year-old girl's testimony about a pillar of the community could easily enter. He stood in his doorway in his sleeping cloth, lamp in hand, looking down at the girl, at her bleeding knuckles, at her cut feet, at the bark marks pressed into her cheek from the neem tree branch. And he assembled all the reasons why what she was telling him was impossible. He was good at assembling reasons. He had done it many times in his long life, and the reasons had generally held. But Amma's face in the lamplight undid him. Not her words, not her evidence, her face. The particular quality of stillness in it, that ancient, shattered calm that had no business being on an 11-year-old face. That was the face not of a frightened child, but of a person who has seen something that has permanently rearranged the furniture of their understanding of the world, and who is now navigating the rearranged room with the careful, deliberate tread of someone who knows that not all the new positions of things are safe to walk into in the dark. He looked at that face for a long time. Then he went inside to put on his cloth. He sent his grandson to 4 other compounds with instructions that were simple, and left no room for the kind of questions that delay. By the time the moon had moved a full hand's width across the sky, 7 men stood in the path outside Mama Yolanda's gate. With them were the fathers, the father of Kofi, the father of Akosua, the father of the twins. Men who had been woken from the specific, unrestorative sleep of bereaved fathers. Men who had been living for months or years in the low, constant fever of unresolved grief. They had machetes, they had torches, they had the particular, quiet, very dangerous fury of men who have been patient far beyond the point that patience was warranted, and who have just been told with flat-voiced certainty that their patience was a wound they had been making in themselves for nothing. They did not pause at the gate. They did not knock or call out or announce themselves. There was no longer a language that felt appropriate for any of that. The language of knocking belongs to the world where things are still uncertain, where you might be wrong, where the door might open onto something other than what you fear. They were past that world now. They walked through the gate as though the gate were not there, and the gate, perhaps sensing the nature of what was walking through it, offered only token resistance before it gave. The torches lit the yard in moving, leaping orange. The cooking fire was out, cold ash and gray coals. The sugar cane stood in its rows along the wall, innocent and still. The clay pot sat beside the cold fire, its lid in place, and the smell that came from it was not the warm groundnut smell of the daytime, but something else, something that none of the men could name, and none of them would later try to. The door to the main house opened before they had crossed half the yard. Mama Yolanda stepped out. She was in the white cloth still, cleaner now, redraped, as though she had had time to arrange herself. And she was standing in the doorway with her arms slightly open and her chin raised, and every line of her body communicating the absolute bone-deep authority of a woman who has never in her life opened a door to find something she could not manage on the other side of it. The torchlight hit her face, and she was extraordinary. Even now, even with 8 furious men in her compound in the middle of the night. The beauty was intact and functioning, and it hit the men in the torchlight the way it always hit everyone. In the chest, below the ribs,
in the involuntary part of the nervous system that responds to beauty before the thinking mind has a chance to qualify the response. Several of the torches dipped. Not much, but they dipped. "What is this?" Her voice was low and unhurried, carrying across the yard with an ease that should not have been possible in a space full of heavy breathing and the sound of rope being gripped. "Have you completely lost your minds? Coming to a woman's compound in the night like a pack of bush animals? Who sent you? What is this?" She looked at each of them in turn, the sweep of those amber eyes moving from face to face with the slow, measuring confidence of a woman conducting an inventory of something she fully owns. And she let the silence extend just long enough for the authority of her gaze to do its work. It was a technique refined over decades, centuries perhaps. The silence of a person who is not afraid of you, and whose lack of fear is meant to produce fear in you. Two of the men shifted their weight. One cleared his throat. Then Amma stepped forward. She had been standing at the back of the group, the only child present, barefoot, her cut feet leaving faint dark marks on the compound earth. And she walked through the men the way water finds a path through stones, deliberate and without hesitation, until she was standing at the front, 5 paces from Mama Yolanda, in the full light of the torches. She raised her right arm. She pointed at the padlocked hut. She said, in a voice that was entirely free of drama, and entirely free of fear, and entirely free of any inflection whatsoever, a voice that was just a fact being stated by a person for whom facts were the only remaining currency. "Open it." The compound went very still. Mama Yolanda's gaze moved from Amma's pointing arm to Amma's face, and it traveled slowly, the way a predator's gaze moves when it is assessing something rather than dismissing it. And what it found in Amma's face, that ancient shattered stillness, those dry eyes, the bark marks on the cheek, seemed to produce in it for the first time something that was not quite confidence. She opened her mouth. And then something happened to her face. It was subtle, a flicker, a brief, involuntary disruption of the surface, like a reflection disturbed by a stone dropped into still water, the image breaking apart for a moment, the pieces separating, showing something beneath the surface before the water settled again. It lasted perhaps 1 second, perhaps less. But every person in that compound saw it. And in that 1 second, in that brief, involuntary flicker, they saw, all of them, simultaneously, each of them without exception, that they were not looking at a woman. They were looking at a hunger. Old, vast, patient, cold. A hunger that had been operating behind the face of a woman for longer than any of them could imagine. Feeding through that face the way a hand operates a puppet. And that face was the most sophisticated thing it had ever built. Its finest and most successful instrument, the product of centuries of refinement. And it had just, for one unguarded second, shown them the hand. Elder Asante did not want to look at Mama Yolanda's face again. He turned from her and walked to the padlocked hut, and he raised his walking staff, the one he had carried for 30 years, smoothed to a dark shine by 3 decades of his palm, and he brought it down on the padlock. The first blow rang out like a bell in the still compound. The second produced a crack in the hasp, the third broke it. The padlock fell to the earth. Elder Asante reached out and pushed the door, and it swung inward on its hinges, slowly, and the compound was immediately filled with the smell that rolled out of the darkness inside. Iron and old sweetness, and something so ancient that it preceded any human nose that had ever tried to identify it. Something that the body recognized before the mind did, that walked straight through every civilized and rational filter and spoke directly to the oldest part of the nervous system, the part that was there before language, before thought, before any story that had ever been told around any fire. The part that knows what death smells like, and what is worse than death. Inside the hut, in the torchlight that spilled through the open door, they found the child from the neighboring hamlet, alive, barely, in a condition that none of the men would ever describe in detail to anyone. Not their wives, not their friends, not the priests, not each other. Because there are things that the mind, as a mercy to itself, learns to keep in very small rooms with very thick walls. And around the walls of the hut, on hooks and shelves and in the spaces in between, were the other things, the things that constituted the proof. The accumulated evidence of years, of decades, of a practice conducted with unhurried patience in this padlocked room, while the village slept and the nightbirds called in the iroko trees, and the children of Aboabo played in the paths outside and ran to their gate for sugarcane and candied tamarind. The fathers of the missing dropped to their knees in the red earth of the compound, and the sounds they made had no words in them. Only grief has a grammar of its own, a grammar that does not require a language to learn, that every human being arrives in the world already knowing how to speak. They were speaking it now, speaking it at full volume, into the orange torchlight, into the dark iroko trees, into the face of a compound that had held the secret for longer than their children had been alive. Mama Yolanda ran.
She ran the way things run when they have spent a very long time not needing to run and have therefore forgotten that they can be caught with everything, instantly, no graduated response, no assessment of options, pure velocity. She was a white blur across the compound yard, past the cold cooking fire and the clay pot and the sugar cane that had served its purpose so well for so long, and she was at the far wall of the compound in less time than it took the nearest man to understand what was happening and begin to move in response. She hit the wall at a height that should not have been achievable. Her fingers found the top of it, a wall that stood taller than the tallest man present, and she was over it and on the other side, and the Iroko trees were 10 paces away and darkening by the second as the torchlight fell behind her. The first man over the wall after her reached her just as her fingers touched the bark of the nearest Iroko. He grabbed her arm. She turned. She did something with her free hand that Ama, watching from near the gate, could not see clearly in the darkness, but the man's cry cut the night air like a blade, and he fell away from her and did not get up quickly. The second man came from her left and wrapped both arms around her from behind, and she reached back with a sureness that suggested she could feel exactly where he was without needing to see him, found his shoulder with both hands, and what she did to it made a sound that 10 people present heard clearly, and that all 10 of them would have given a great deal not to have heard. He made a sound too, briefly, and then he was sitting on the ground, and she was still moving. 8 men brought her down, 8 grown men moving together, hitting her from multiple directions simultaneously, because anyone who had tried it singly or in pairs had already discovered that singly and in pairs was nowhere near enough. They hit the ground in a mass, bodies, torches, cloth, rope, the sound of impact and struggle, and a ferocity that came from both sides with equal conviction, and they held her, and they were still holding her 10 minutes later, and it cost them. 2 cracked ribs between 3 different men, 1 dislocated shoulder, 3 forearms raked by nails that left marks deep enough to scar, and did scar, and the scars were shown to grandchildren in the decades that followed as casually as battle scars are shown, because that is exactly what they were. While they held her, her face did what it had done briefly in the compound yard, but now without the restraint, without the effort to maintain the surface, because the surface was no longer useful, and the energy required to maintain it was needed elsewhere. It moved, it shifted. The beauty flickered in and out like a lamp in a high wind, present, then interrupted, then present again, then interrupted for longer, and in the spaces between the beauty, the faces of the 8 men who were holding her were lit by something that was not the beauty, and was its precise opposite, something that looked back at them with eyes that had been looking at human beings for so long they had lost even the pretense of finding them interesting, seeing in each of them nothing more than duration, how much more of it they contained, how it might be taken. She screamed in that old language. The sound went through the trees and up into the sky, and the effect was immediate and total. Every night bird in the surrounding forest went silent at once. Hundreds of creatures, owls and nightjars and the small birds that call through the dark, all going silent in the same second, so that the ambient sound of the night, which people rarely notice until it stops, simply vanished. The silence it left was enormous, architectural, the kind of silence that has volume and weight and that sits on the chest. Then the fireflies went out, not gradually, not drifting away, not fading, out. Between one blink and the next, every firefly in the surrounding forest simply stopped producing light, and the darkness between the trees deepened by a degree that was not dramatic enough to be described as darkness falling, but that every person present felt as a kind of subtraction, something taken from the air. The river, faintly audible at the edge of the village on still nights, seemed to pause. The sound of moving water, which had been a constant, barely noticed background presence for every person in Aboabo their entire lives, was simply not there for perhaps 4 or 5 seconds, long enough to notice, long enough to feel in the stomach what the absence of something permanent is like. Then the 8 men got the rope on her and drew it tight, and the screaming in the old language cut off as the rope pressed against her throat, and the birds came back, cautiously, one at a time, and the fireflies reappeared as if testing the air before committing, and the river resumed its quiet commentary on the movement of water through the world. They tied her hands, they tied her feet, loosely enough allowing movement. They stood her up between them, the 8 men, and they held the ropes between them, and they walked her out through the compound gate and into the village path. The village was awake. Every lamp and Aboabo had been lit, every door was open, the entire population of the village, men, women, children, the oldest elder who had not walked unaided for 6 years and was being held up tonight by his 2 grandsons, the youngest infant wrapped against its mother's back and not crying, as if it too understood that something was happening that required silence and attention. All of them were in the paths between compounds, in their doorways, in the open spaces between the houses. Nobody had organized this. Nobody had gone door to door. They had simply awakened, all of them, in the hour past midnight, with the particular clarity of waking that happens not when you are disturbed by a sound, but when the air changes, when something in the quality of the night shifts from the ordinary darkness of a village asleep to something older and more urgent that the sleeping body recognizes and acts on before the waking mind has caught up. They stood in the lamplight and they watched as the 8 men walked Mama Yolanda, bound, her white cloth torn, her hair loose and wild around a face that had given up the performance of being human, down the main path towards the town square. Nobody spoke. Nobody needed to.
The whole village gathered in the town square. They bound Mama Yolanda to the central post. The pyre was built with her own sugarcane at its base. Elder Asante looked her in the eye and asked simply, "What are you?" She smiled her full smile and said, "I am what you all are. I simply refused to end." He nodded once. The first torch flew. She screamed in a language older than the village, and the crowd held each other and did not look away. Then the flames turned blue, cold, instantaneous, otherworldly. Then silence. Then orange again. Mama Yolanda was still. The village exhaled, one breath, all of them together, releasing something they hadn't known they'd been carrying. Amos stood at the front and watched until only coals remained, and the first light touched the eastern hill. It was done. The fire died to ash. Nobody left the square. Dawn came slowly, like it wasn't sure it was welcome. Then, from the smoke, voices. Children's voices, small and quiet and not in pain. The mothers heard them first. Abina covered her mouth. The blacksmith wept openly. The mother of Akosua sat down in the red earth and looked up in silence. Amma stood still at the front and listened. Among all the voices, she heard Kofi. He said her name once, just her name, the way he always said it. Amma. She closed her eyes and gave everything she had left to that sound, every cut, every sleepless night, every hour in the neem tree, until the voice thinned and rose with the smoke and became part of the morning air. She opened her eyes. It was over. The sun came over the eastern hill, no longer apologetic, a real morning. Amma breathed in, breathed out. She was finished. After the burning, the village of Aboabo gave Mama Yolanda's ashes to the river and tore her compound down to bare earth. Women planted healing things where she once lived. 7 stones were laid in a garden, one for each child, and their names were spoken aloud every year, so no generation would forget. The survivor healed.
Amma grew up to become the most trusted mediator in the region, patient, sharp, impossible to deceive with a beautiful surface. When she died in old age, they gave her the 8th stone, for the girl who climbed the neem tree and did not look away. The Iroko trees reclaimed the ground, the names remained, and old men walking the river path still felt warmth rising through the earth at that spot. The earth, as it always does, keeping its own quiet account of everything that happened there.